Alberta recently passed Bill 1, which is designed to provide penalties for people who are protesting. Primarily, I think the target is energy infrastructure like pipelines, and that's raised a lot of concern in Alberta and really across the country. And so to discuss that today, we've got Professor Jennifer Koshan from the University of Calgary. So welcome to the interview, Jennifer.
Thanks, Markham.
Now, why don't we start with an overview of what's in Bill 1?
All right, so Bill 1 is actually a very short piece of legislation. It's only 5 sections long, and the key provisions are found in the definition of essential infrastructure, which does include things like pipelines, utilities, railways, but also it includes things like city streets, sidewalks, city squares, and the land surrounding those different pieces of so-called essential infrastructure. After that definition section, what the bill does is to set out a number of prohibitions, including not only obstructing or damaging essential infrastructure, but even just entering onto essential infrastructure. Section 3 then sets out some offenses if someone is to contravene those prohibitions, and those penalties include both fines and imprisonment. And each day that a contravention continues is a new offense. So the possibility of very large fines is a big one. And then Section 5 is a regulation making section, which allows the provincial cabinet to add to the number of things that are defined as essential infrastructure. So that's an overview of the bill.
Now, is one of the comments that I've seen, the most common one probably, is that this bill is almost for sure going to be, is unconstitutional. And what's your take on that?
I've looked at the bill with a couple of colleagues, and in fact, we have a blog post coming out on our faculty blog tomorrow, a blog, and we're of the opinion that the bill does violate several sections of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms: freedom of association, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of expression, life, liberty, and security of the person, and equality rights. Our view is also that the bill can't be justified by the government because, of course, whenever there's a violation of charter rights, the government does have an opportunity to argue that their law is a reasonable limit on charter rights, but we don't believe that's the case.
Another criticism that I've heard of the bill is that, in fact, all of the provisions or the activities that it seeks to regulate are already regulated by other legislation.
That's true for the most part, and we do talk about that in our bill. So in Alberta, we have the Petty Trespass Act and the Trespass to Premises Act, which do allow property owners to give notice to people not to enter onto their land, whether that's public or private land. The big difference with this bill is that it doesn't require that kind of prior written notice to be posted for people to be banned from entering onto essential infrastructure and the surrounding lands. There's also some overlap with the criminal code because the criminal code contains provisions dealing with mischief and dealing with forcible entry onto property. So I think one good question is whether Bill 1 is even needed, but at the same time, Bill 1 does go further than any of those other pieces of legislation in making it an offense to simply enter onto essential infrastructure. So what that means is that people who are simply holding a protest, whether at a pipeline construction site or in a city square, on a city street, that in itself constitutes an offense under Bill 1.
The energy media has taken the position editorially that we both support the construction of the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline, but also support the rights of people to oppose it and protest, as long as they do it in a legal, a lawful manner. And it seems to me that the Bill 1 is designed to make protesting in a legal and lawful manner, if not impossible, very difficult.
Yes, I think that's true. And in fact, if you look at the Hansard debates when the bill was being debated in the legislature in Alberta, one of the purposes behind the bill that the government put forward was to dissuade people from undertaking those sorts of protests. Now, the government put it in terms of upholding the rule of law, but I think we also have to recognize that the rule of law includes our constitutional rights and freedoms. And if people have the freedom to express themselves, to peacefully assemble, and so on, and the government is constraining that, then there is the real possibility of a charter challenge here.
Now, this legislation seems to me to mimic or try to copy some of the legislation we've seen in the US, like Texas brought in anti-pipeline protesting law. And of course, that was very popular in the Texas industry. And I imagine that Bill 1 is very popular in the Canadian industry. But this trend seems disturbing to me. Am I right in being concerned?
Well, I think it's right to be concerned about this trend. And again, not only as concerns pipelines. I mean, that's an important context, I know, for the people who follow you. But my big concern is that the bill defines essential infrastructure so broadly that we could see it banning things like the Black Lives Matters protest that took place in Olympic Plaza yesterday. Olympic Plaza is considered to be the sort of essential infrastructure where people could be charged simply for entering onto that property and undertaking a peaceful protest. And for me, one of the big concerns with the bill is that when we think about the groups who undertake protests, they often are marginalized groups in society, including Indigenous peoples in Alberta. The one thing I should say is that Bill 1 does allow people to be on land, on essential infrastructure, if they have a lawful right. And so that may include Indigenous land rights, but lawful right isn't defined in the bill. And so it's still unclear what kind of legal excuses people could put forward for being on the property and having protests there.
Right. This will be the final question, Jennifer. Is it likely that this legislation will be challenged in court immediately, even by the federal government or by one of the civil liberty groups, somebody like that?
So you mentioned the federal government. I think another interesting aspect of the bill is that it may tread on the federal government's criminal law powers, and that's something that we hope to write about on our blog in the next little while as well. If it was left up to a civil liberties group, I think we have to recognize that can be a very expensive undertaking. And certainly for individuals, especially individuals who are marginalized, who will be primarily caught by Bill 1, I think it's actually very, very difficult to say, you know, we're passing this law that might be unconstitutional. A lot of commenters are concerned that it's unconstitutional, but we're still going to bring that law into place and just leave it up to the courts to decide. I think the government should really be reconsidering whether this bill is an appropriate one to give royal assent to, because on its face, it does appear to be unconstitutional.
Professor Koshan, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it. And I guess we'll see where this goes. We may have you back on to discuss this in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Markham.